What if Vladimir Putin's greatest defeat in Ukraine has nothing to do with the battlefield? What if the most important territory Russia is losing is not a city, a trench, or a kilometer of land, but an entire political world? Look at a map of the former Soviet Union from the Baltic Sea to the Caucasus, from the Black Sea to the mountains of Central Asia. For decades, Moscow sat at the center of that map like gravity. Governments depended on Russian energy. Workers depended on Russian labor markets. Military alliances depended on Russian weapons. Trade routes ran through Russian territory. And when political leaders in these countries looked for security, there was usually one capital they had to consider: Moscow. That was Russia's invisible empire. The Soviet Union disappeared in Fey, but the system built around it did not. And that is what makes the war in Ukraine so strategically important, because Putin may have entered the war believing he was expanding Russian power. But the longer the war continues, the more one question becomes impossible to ignore. What if Russia is winning battles in Ukraine while losing the political empire behind it? The hero of this story, is not a tank. It is not a missile. It is not even Ukraine. It is the Russian sphere of influence And the central question is simple. Can Moscow maintain control over the countries that once depended on it when those countries finally realize they have alternatives? To understand the answer, you have to leave Ukraine, go east, then south. Then look across the Caucasus and Central Asia. For much of the 20th century, Moscow did not need to occupy every inch of these regions. It only needed to make sure that leaving was expensive. That was the real architecture of Russian influence: energy pipelines, railways, military bases, trade agreements, remittances, security guarantees, and political networks that survived long after Soviet flags came down. On paper, the Soviet Union collapsed. In practice, Russia inherited much of its infrastructure of influence. That distinction matters, because empires do not always disappear when their borders disappear. Sometimes they survive inside the systems that connect countries together. The Baltic states were among the first to escape. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they turned west. They joined the European Union. They joined NATO. They connected their electricity systems to Europe. And gradually, the old Russian gravitational pull weakened. But for many other former Soviet republics, that escape was far more difficult. Imagine a factory in Central Asia. Its supply chain was built during the Soviet period. Its rail lines point north. Its workers travel to Russia. Its families depend on money sent home from Russian cities. Its energy network still carries Russian influence. Breaking away is not a speech. It is an engineering problem, an economic problem, a security problem, and sometimes a survival problem. That is why Moscow's influence lasted so long. Russia did not necessarily need to threaten every neighbor. It simply needed to remain the easiest option. And for decades, it was. But here is the first contradiction. The system that made Russia powerful also made Russia vulnerable. Because dependency works both ways. If a country has only one supplier, one market, one security partner, then it appears trapped until another option arrives. And suddenly, the entire balance changes. The war in Ukraine accelerates. Countries that once believed Russia was the only realistic power capable of protecting their interests began asking a different question. What happens if Russia cannot protect itself? That question became impossible to ignore after February. Before the invasion, Russia's military reputation carried enormous strategic weight. Moscow had nuclear weapons, a massive military, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and decades of experience projecting power across the former Soviet space. For neighboring governments, the calculation was straightforward. If Russia was willing to use force in its own neighborhood, then challenging Moscow could be dangerous. But Ukraine changed the equation. The the war exposed the limits of Russian military power. It also exposed something even more important. Russia could be consumed by one war, and while Moscow was focused on Ukraine, other countries were watching, not with tanks, with spreadsheets, with diplomatic meetings, with new trade routes, with energy contracts, with quiet conversations about what comes next. This is where the story begins to move beyond the battlefield, because every kilometer of Russian military attention directed toward Ukraine creates space somewhere else. And other powers are moving into that space. China, Turkey, the European Union, the Gulf states, each offer something different: investment, trade, energy, infrastructure, security. No single country needs to replace Russia completely. They only need to make Russia less necessary, and that is a much easier task. The first major test came in the South Caucasus. For decades, Armenia depended heavily on Moscow for security. Russia had military forces in the country. Armenia was part of Russian-led security structures. The relationship was not simply diplomatic, it was strategic. But then came the war in Ukraine, and suddenly, the Russian security guarantee looked different. The problem was not only whether Russia wanted to help, the problem was whether Russia still had the capacity to do so. That distinction is enormous. A security guarantee is valuable only if the country offering it can actually enforce it. And when Moscow's military resources became increasingly tied down in Ukraine, Armenia began looking elsewhere. Europe became more important. Western diplomatic engagement increased, and Armenia's relationship with Russia began to change. But here is the contradiction. The more Russia tries to preserve influence through pressure, the more it can accelerate the very defection it wants to prevent. When a smaller country believes Moscow is threatening it for moving west, the threat itself becomes evidence that moving west may be necessary. The result is a strategic trap. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates more pressure, and eventually influence becomes coercion. That is when influence begins to disappear. Now move west to Moldova. Moldova represents a different version of the same story. For years, Russia held enormous leverage over the country, energy, trade. And most importantly, Transnistria, that narrow strip of territory along Moldova's eastern border, became a permanent pressure point. A frozen conflict does not need to produce daily fighting to be strategically useful. Sometimes its greatest value is the threat of what could happen if the political situation changes. But after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the meaning of Transnistria changed. The buffer became a vulnerability. The Russian presence that once looked like a guarantee of influence increasingly looked like a reminder of Moldova's strategic exposure. Moldova began moving toward Europe. Energy dependence on Russia declined. European integration became a national objective, and the country began building a future in which Moscow was no longer the center of its political universe. That is the hidden transformation. Russia did not necessarily lose Moldova in one dramatic event. It lost influence through thousands of smaller decisions. A new energy contract, a new trade partner, a new diplomatic relationship. A new generation that no longer sees Moscow as inevitable. The empire does not collapse all at once. It becomes unnecessary. And nowhere is that process more strategically important than Central Asia. Look at Kazakhstan. The country sits in one of the most strategically important positions on Earth, between Russia and China, rich in energy, rich in minerals, and connected to the emerging trade routes linking Asia with Europe. For decades, Moscow was the natural center of that system. But now Kazakhstan has options. China is interested, Europe is interested, Turkey is interested, the Gulf states are interested, and that changes everything. Because the moment a country has multiple partners, Russian leverage decreases. The Middle Corridor is a perfect example. A trade route running across Central Asia and the Caspian Sea toward Europe can reduce dependence on Russian territory. It is not simply infrastructure, it is geopolitical insurance. And that is the part most people miss. A railway can be a strategic weapon, A pipeline can be a foreign policy tool. A shipping route can redraw an empire. The battle for influence is not always fought with soldiers. Sometimes it is fought with ports, cables, railways, energy contracts, and customs agreements. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Russia is not disappearing from Central Asia, not yet. Many countries still depend on Russian labor markets, Russian energy, Russian security structures, and Russian economic networks. That dependence cannot be erased overnight. So the region is not choosing between Russia and the West in one dramatic decision. It is doing something far more dangerous for Moscow. It is hedging, keeping Russia close enough to avoid confrontation, while building enough alternatives to survive without it. And once a country learns it can survive without one great power, the psychological balance changes permanently. That is the real threat to an empire, not rebellion independence. Because independence begins long before a flag changes. It begins when a government quietly decides it has options. And across the former Soviet space, those options are multiplying. The question is no longer whether Russia still has influence. It clearly does. The question is something much more uncomfortable. How much of that influence is now based on genuine loyalty, and how much survives only because the alternatives have not yet fully arrived. And if Ukraine has taught Russia's neighbors anything, it may be this: waiting for Moscow to change may be more dangerous than preparing for a world in which Moscow is no longer the center. That realization is spreading. And the next country to act may not be the one everyone is watching. It may be the one Moscow still believes it owns. Everyone thinks this war is about territory, about trenches in Donbass, about missiles over Kiev, about whether Russia can capture another city before Ukraine stops it. But the real battle is about something much harder to measure: control for decades. Moscow's greatest military advantage was never simply the number of tanks it possessed. It was the assumption that countries around Russia had nowhere else to go. That assumption was a weapon, and now it is disappearing. Look at a map of Eurasia. The borders haven't changed dramatically overnight, but the lines connecting those countries to Moscow are beginning to fade. New trade routes appear. New military partnerships form. New energy agreements are signed. New flags appear at diplomatic summits. And behind every one of those decisions is the same question: if Russia cannot guarantee security, prosperity, or political stability, why should its neighbors remain dependent on it? That is the invisible battlefield Putin may have underestimated. Not land, not tanks, dependency. And Ukraine has become the catalyst accelerating that transformation. Before Russia could present itself as an unavoidable regional power. A country might dislike Moscow, it might fear Moscow, but it still needed Moscow. That was the system. Russia provided energy. Russia provided migrant labor markets. Russia provided military hardware. Russia provided security guarantees. And when those tools worked together, Moscow didn't need to occupy every capital. It only needed to make leaving more dangerous than staying. But then the invasion changed the calculation. Suddenly, the countries living inside Russia's orbit had a real-world demonstration of what Moscow's security guarantees actually meant. A country that was supposed to be protected by geography was attacked. A military that was supposed to be feared became trapped in a prolonged war. And a government that claimed to represent a powerful empire suddenly had to spend enormous resources simply maintaining pressure on one battlefield. The lesson was impossible to ignore. If Russia could not quickly dominate Ukraine, could it really guarantee the security of Armenia? Could it control Central Asia? Could it dictate the future of Belarus? The answer did not have to be spoken. Governments could simply start preparing for a world in which Moscow was weaker. And that is where the story becomes much more dangerous for Russia. Because influence is not lost when an embassy closes. Influence is lost when a government quietly builds an alternative, a railway, a pipeline, a military relationship, a new export market, a second passport, a different electricity grid. Each decision looks insignificant by itself. Together, they create something far more powerful. Strategic independence. Look at Kazakhstan. The country does not need to openly confront Moscow to weaken Russian influence. It can simply build another route. The Trans-Caspian Corridor is one example. Goods can move from China through Central Asia, across the Caspian Sea, into the Caucasus, and toward Europe without depending entirely on Russian territory. That is not just economics. It is geography being rewritten. For centuries, Russia benefited from controlling the routes across the Eurasian interior. Now, technology, infrastructure, and investment are giving neighboring states more options, and options are power. The same principle applies to energy. For decades, energy dependence gave Moscow leverage. A pipeline was never just a pipeline. It was political influence made of steel. But once a country finds another supplier, another route, or another source of electricity, the pipeline loses part of its strategic value. The weapon does not disappear. It simply becomes less effective. That is why the geopolitical consequences of the Ukraine war extend far beyond the battlefield. Russia is fighting to preserve influence at the same moment that its neighbors are discovering how to live without it. And here's the contradiction. The harder Moscow tries to force countries back into its orbit, the more urgently those countries search for alternatives. Pressure creates resistance. Resistance creates diversification, and diversification makes future pressure less effective. This is the strategic trap. But the story doesn't end with Russia, because the space Moscow is losing is not remaining empty. China is moving in, Turkey is moving in, the European Union is moving in, and in different ways, the United States is watching closely. The former Soviet sphere is becoming a competitive geopolitical marketplace. In Central Asia, China brings trade, infrastructure, investment, and access to global markets. Turkey offers cultural connections and military cooperation. Europe offers economic integration and political institutions. And Russia still offers energy, security relationships, and historical ties. The competition is no longer simply between Russia and the West. It is becoming a multi-directional contest for influence. That changes the entire strategic picture, because Moscow no longer controls the choices. The countries themselves do. And that may be the most important transformation of all. For decades, Russia's neighbors were treated as pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. Now, increasingly, they are becoming players. But here is the problem for them. Leaving Russia's orbit is not the same as becoming completely independent. A country can reduce Russian influence and still remain vulnerable to another powerful neighbor. A state that replaces Russian energy dependence with Chinese economic dependence has changed partners. It has not necessarily escaped dependency. And this is where the future becomes uncertain, because the collapse of one sphere of influence does not automatically create freedom. Sometimes it creates a competition to replace it. That competition is already visible across the Caucasus and Central Asia. The question is no longer whether Moscow has influence. It does. The question is how much influence it can maintain when its neighbors have alternatives. And alternatives change behavior. A government that once accepted a Russian demand because it had no choice can now delay, negotiate, refuse, or quietly turn somewhere else. That is how empires weaken in the modern era. Not always with revolutions. Sometimes with paperwork, a trade agreement signed in another capital, a military exercise with another partner, a new railway bypassing an old route, a speech that describes history differently. One decision at a time, The battlefield in Ukraine therefore becomes something much larger than a war between two states. It becomes a test of whether military force can preserve geopolitical influence once the economic and political foundations beneath it begin to disappear. And this brings us back to the original hero of the story, Russia's near abroad. The territory Moscow spent generations treating as its strategic backyard. The countries that were supposed to remain close. The governments that were expected to look toward Moscow first. The assumption that Russian power would always be there. That assumption is now being tested, and the most revealing sign may not come from a battlefield at all. It may come from a map showing where the next railway is built, where the next pipeline flows, where the next military exercise takes place, where the next president makes their first diplomatic visit. Because those decisions reveal something weapons cannot. They reveal where a country believes its future lies. Strategically, this changes the meaning of the Ukraine war. Russia may still possess nuclear weapons. It may still field one of the world's largest militaries. It may still have enormous territory, energy resources, and the ability to impose serious costs on its neighbors. None of that disappears overnight. But military power has limits. A tank can cross a border. It cannot force another country to trust you. A missile can destroy infrastructure. It cannot rebuild an alliance. And an army can occupy territory, but it cannot easily manufacture dependence once alternative systems exist. That may be the deepest lesson of the conflict. Power is not simply the ability to destroy. Power is the ability to shape what other countries believe they must do. And Russia's greatest strategic problem may be that its neighbors are beginning to believe they have choices. That is why the war's ultimate consequences may take decades to measure. Even if the fighting in Ukraine eventually stops, the geopolitical damage may continue. A ceasefire does not automatically restore trust. A peace agreement does not rebuild lost influence. And a withdrawal from the battlefield does not reverse years of strategic adaptation. The infrastructure has already begun changing. The relationships have already begun changing. The political calculations have already begun changing. Once a country learns that it can survive outside Moscow's orbit, returning to the old system becomes much harder. And that raises the most uncomfortable question for the Kremlin. What happens if Russia wins territory in Ukraine, but loses the strategic environment around it? What happens if Moscow gains a few kilometers of land while losing decades of influence? What happens if the war intended to restore Russian power instead accelerates the independence of the very countries Russia wanted to control? That is the paradox. Putin may have entered the war believing he was fighting to prevent Russia from becoming strategically irrelevant. But the longer the conflict continues, the more the countries around Russia are preparing for a future in which Moscow is no longer the center of their world. The question is no longer whether Russia can hold every inch of its battlefield. The real question is whether it can hold the political system that made its battlefield power matter in the first place, because empires rarely disappear in a single moment. They disappear when enough people stop believing they are permanent. So here is the question. Do you think the Ukraine war is ultimately weakening Russia's military power? Or is it doing something even more consequential by permanently breaking Moscow's influence over the former Soviet world?